The Pokemon Sword and Shield TCG sets are on their way, and last week we got an update about changes being made to the TCG overall. Some of these changes are major, and some of them are pretty minor, but either way, they are important to know going into the Sword and Shield sets, knowing how to play online as well as in person or at official events. So first, let's start with one that we already knew, and that was that EX Pokemon and GX Pokemon were out. They're being replaced by V Pokemon. This is one that doesn't really change the game all that much because the V Pokemon are being treated like they were EX or GX, wherein if they get knocked out, your opponent gets 2 prizes. But the change here that I'm excited about is the card layout and the card art. I was not a fan of EX or GX Pokemon art because they used the CG artwork and it never really looked right. It always looked really cheap, especially when compared to the high quality traditional artwork that were on just commons and uncommons. But I think that this Zacian V card looks incredible. The black border contrasting with the really bright colors in the artwork looks great, and the CG artwork actually looks cool here. And I don't know if the graphics on their CG generators have actually improved or if it's the card layout that really makes it pop more. Whatever it is, just the black borders, the full card art, and just the brightness and vividness of those colors in the artwork really make these cards look great and collectible. We will also have these VMAX cards, which are the Gigantamax versions of Pokemon and kind of serve like Mega Evolution did, where it's technically an evolution of the V Pokemon, but in this case, it's actually 3 prize cards your opponent will take if they knock it out, which is kind of filling that niche that tag teams did, and with something that has 340 HP, yeah, you should probably get 3 prize cards for knocking it out. So now let's get into the first major change that was announced last week, and that is starting on February 21st of 2020, you can no longer play a supporter card on your first turn. Amongst competitive players, this has been the most controversial change because it does greatly limit what you can do on turn 1. However, I think this is a really great choice. If you've watched my video on banned cards, a lot of them are supporter cards that really just give you an unfair advantage on turn 1 when you use them. So it makes sense to just go ahead and say, well, you just can't use the supporters on turn 1 anymore. And that's going to limit the amount of cards that they end up having to ban in the long run, which I think is a really smart choice. This move is especially wise when you consider cards that have major power creep like Zamazenta V, where if you consider your opponent playing down this basic Pokemon with 230 HP, attaching an energy to it, and being able to play a supporter card, then they're always gonna be a huge step ahead of you, and going first is always gonna give a huge advantage even if you're not able to attack. So this first change does seem like a pretty proactive way to deal with the power creep that the Pokemon Company knows is coming because they've designed all of these cards, and just kind of try to take care of it before it gets too out of hand and ruins the entire metagame. Almost like they learned some kind of lesson about how terrible the Sun and Moon metagame got. The next big change is made to weaknesses and resistance. So resistances will no longer be minus 20 damage, instead they will be minus 30 damage. So it will specify at the bottom of the card, so if you're playing expanded, you'll go by whatever number is listed on the card. And some changes are being made to general weaknesses because the TCG is moving around a lot of Pokemon and recategorizing types, which we'll get to in a minute. So water type Pokemon in general are now weak to lightning instead of grass. Psychic type Pokemon are now weak to dark instead of psychic, which normally represented the ghost type. Dark type Pokemon will now be weak to grass, which is representing the dark weakness to bug, instead of fighting. And so what we're really seeing here is a huge buff to dark type Pokemon, as they're going to be super effective against most psychic types, and they're going to be weak to grass instead of fighting. Now, fighting type represents rock, ground, and fighting types within the game, so dark type Pokemon were weak technically to a lot more Pokemon because of that consolidation, and now grass will actually get buffed a little bit too, and honestly they needed it. Grass and bug type Pokemon have not really been well represented in the card game as of late, and these are pretty general statements to make about weaknesses, so we will have to wait and see how this plays out and actually affects individual Pokemon on a case-by-case basis. Especially considering the third major change, which is that fairy type Pokemon will no longer exist within the TCG. This is pretty big since fairy type is relatively new to the TCG, being introduced in X and Y, and now with Sword and Shield they're being consolidated into Psychic type already. They don't really state why fairy type was chosen to be eliminated or consolidated when you consider that Dragon type is still within the game, and one of the biggest discussions right now is what Dragon type cards will now be weak to now that Fairy isn't a type. Are they going to be weak to Psychic now that all Fairy types will now be Psychic types? Or will it change to something like Water types to represent a weakness to Ice? Poison type Pokemon are now going to be Dark type as well. And so you see a lot of change happening here with the Poison type, where they started out as a Grass type, and then when Diamond and Pearl released, all Poison types were changed to Psychic type. And now that Psychic type is getting too crowded, Poison type Pokemon are now going to be Dark. So we are going to get some Pokemon like Nidoqueen that are going to represent a lot of types over the years in the TCG, not even counting the Delta species. I do hope we get more information on this in the future of why Fairy type was eliminated and why other types weren't consolidated in. Now, Dragon type does make a little bit of sense because if you rejoined that to the normal and flying type cards, that typing would get a little more crowded, but Dragon types are still by themselves in a typing. The same goes for Steel types, where it seems like you could probably start taking some Rock types and moving those over to Steel if you really wanted to balance the typings within the TCG as much as possible, because you still do have that Fighting type that's a little overcrowded because it has Fighting, Ground, and Rock Pokemon all within it. But as I said, we will have to wait and see how these changes actually play out, and we'll see if they're actually better for the game. This next change is a very wise choice for the expanded format and standard format moving forward, because as it stands in expanded, you have Professor Sycamore and Professor Juniper, which both do the exact same thing. It's just the name of the card was changed in order to fit the current generation and the professor of whatever game they were representing. And so some people got confused and thought that they could use Sycamore and Juniper in the same deck, run a full playset of each, when that is not the case, because technically they are the exact same card. So moving forward, they will just call this card Professor's Research instead of printing a Professor Magnolia, and moving forward, Sycamore, Juniper, and Professor's Research will all be treated as if they are called Professor's Research. That way, in the future, you can just reprint this card as many times as you want and just change the art on the card to match that professor, and then you won't have to go back and make explicit rules in expanded limiting what cards you can use and having to eliminate that confusion. You just go ahead and eliminate the confusion before it even happens. So moving on to the next change, which is basically just semantics. There's a phase that everyone just called Between Turns, where after you attack, before your opponent's turn would start, you would check certain things like special conditions or the activation of abilities or resolve the effects of an attack. This phase of gameplay has now been given an official name, which is Pokemon Checkup. So any wording on cards that would say in between turns will now just be treated as Pokemon Checkup. So during the checkup phase, you will basically resolve any special conditions that need coin flips, any abilities of trainers or Pokemon abilities, or if any Pokemon are knocked out and need to be replaced by Pokemon on the bench. All of that will happen in checkup, just like it was normally between turns, except now that it has an official name. And while we're talking semantics, we have a new name for removing special conditions from a Pokemon, and that is Recover. So if you're familiar with the TCG, use two cards like Potion would say remove damage counters from your Pokemon. And then later on it was changed to say heal from your Pokemon in order to relieve any confusion people had, because not everyone knew that one damage counter meant 10 HP. So they just changed it to say the HP number, to where a card would say heal 30 from this Pokemon instead of 3 damage counters. So not only does this change help alleviate any confusion people have about removing special conditions, but it also saves space on the card, because now you don't have to say remove a special condition from this Pokemon. You can just say this Pokemon recovers, just to streamline the game a little more and to reduce the amount of text that actually has to be on a card. Similarly, cards will no longer feature reminder text. So a lot of times an ability would say you can use this once per turn, and then in parentheses it would say before you attack. Well, if you're playing this game and you know all of the rules, you know that your turn ends when you attack. So of course, any effect of attack or ability or trainer needs to be done during your turn before you attack. And because it's just understood, it makes a lot of sense to just remove that text from the card. It also helps eliminate any confusion you have between card effects. Like the example they give, you can read there between Persian GX and Heatran GX. So once again, just streamlining the game, removing unnecessary fluff, making the game easier to understand by having universal terms, and by just removing confusing, contradicting elements like listed there with Heatran and Persian before they can actually occur. The final change I want to talk about has to do with the card layout itself. So if you look at this beautiful Dreadnought card that we have coming out in Sword and Shield, look down in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll notice there's a couple of extra symbols there that weren't on older sets. But in particular, that little octagon there with the letter D in it, this is now going to be referred to as a regulation mark and is really going to help people keep track of which cards are legal for standard play. So for example, we may reach a point where the Pokemon Company can just say the standard format now includes any card that has a D down there for the regulation mark. And then maybe in the future, once there are more introduced, they can say, okay, well now standard is going to be all cards that have the regulation mark D and the regulation mark E, or whatever future sets are going to have. This way they don't really have to keep updating ban list or limited list for the TCG, and they can actually print cards that have different regulation marks. So if they want to print a special edition promo that is meant to just be really cool and really powerful, but not really meant for organized play, they can just give it a different regulation mark. That way people know when they're deck building, they can look down in the corner and say, oh, actually, well, this isn't part of standard format because it doesn't have the regulation mark D. This also makes things a little bit easier for people that are Pokemon professors or officiators at official events, where you don't have to memorize all of the cards in every set that's supposed to be part of legal standard. Now you just have to keep track of what letters to look for in the bottom left-hand corner of the card. And it does seem like the letter D will be the indicator for the first Sword and Shield standard format, because even the second set that has been revealed uses the same letter D down there in the bottom left hand corner to signify that it will be part of the same standard as the first set of Sword and Shield that we're getting. And those are all of the changes that have been announced for Sword and Shield going forward in the TCG. I hope that this video has been really helpful and informative for anyone planning on using these sets in competitive or even casual play. Let me know down in those comments what you think about all of these changes. Do you think that they're helpful for the most part? Do you think they're going to be problematic? I'm sure we'll be talking about these changes in the future as these sets roll out, and I do plan on at least playing PTCG-O and kind of experiencing what these sets are like. So I guess look forward to that Sword and Shield TCG content, but rest assured that I have plenty of vintage Pokemon TCG content coming in the meantime as well. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.